Thank you, everyone, for showing up. Thank you, Chris, for inviting us and to all the presenters. It's really exciting. We don't always get a chance to talk about in explicit terms why our field actually makes a difference. So I'm going to start out ethnography. Who knows this word? Raise a hand, please. Show of hands. Oh, lots of people. That's fantastic. So ethnography, as I guess you all know, is the signature method in cultural anthropology. An ethnographer lives with the people they're trying to learn about, actively participates in their everyday life as a method of observation, listens to how people explain things in order to understand their perspective, which could be very different from or very similar to the ethnographer's perspective. It may also be very different from the perspective of people in power. And it's through this potential for ethnography to identify and highlight perspectives or experiences from below, so to speak, that anthropology can make a difference. Ethnography teaches us how to make the connections between ordinary, everyday stuff and the broader processes of systemic inequality of which those ordinary things, stuff, practices, behaviors, conversations, opinions are a part. It helps us identify facts in ways that can undermine dominant and oppressive narratives, as well as to undermine those stereotypes that people in positions of power use to justify injustice. And that's my big point today. And to illustrate it, I'd like to give an example from my own research. I've spent more than a year living in Tanzania at various points over the past few years, conducting ethnographic research in the villages that surround a protected forest. A forest that forms what international conservationists have named one of the world's few biodiversity hotspots. Ecologically, it's an extremely important area, not only because it boasts a vast array of different species, but also the trees there sequester carbon dioxide, thereby mitigating climate change. The forest also protects the soil from erosion, as well as rivers that begin in the mountains and provide water for the entire region, including electricity through a hydropower dam. Now, here's a map of Tanzania, the location in East Africa in the upper left, right, left. Now it's right. And also here in the circle, you can see is where I work. It's the East Usambara Mountains, and that's where I focus my time. The map also shows the protected areas. In Tanzania, conservation is a huge deal politically and economically. More than 30% of Tanzania's land is under protected status. Just picture a third of a country being under protected status. It's also a huge part of the country's GDP with nature tourism and conservation programs bringing in a large amount of foreign revenue. I mean, it's even on the currency, safari animals. It's just a big deal in Tanzania. Now, when we think of a biodiversity hotspot, a national park or a nature reserve or even a protected forest, it's really easy to imagine, I don't know what, like monkeys jumping around, right? Elephants are roaming about. But it's harder to imagine ordinary people going about their business in these places. And this is because many protected areas are established in order to remove people from the landscape, to make a romantic, ideal vision of nature, a place without people, a reality. But in Tanzania, with so much of the land under protected status, many people live next to protected areas. Or let me phrase this differently. Many protected areas are established in places where people are already living. From the early 1900s, first German and then later on British colonizers in Tanzania set up boundaries around areas upon which people relied for their daily needs. European restrictions on where people could not go interfered with agricultural and herding livelihoods, and sometimes those restrictions have included evictions from ancestral lands. Strict enforcement has expanded and continued under the independent Tanzanian government as well. And as perhaps you can imagine, an effort to forcefully impose an idea of nature without people in a place where there are people has resulted in conflict, tensions, and poverty and marginalization on the borders of many protected areas. Common justifications include accusations that people who live next to protected areas do not understand the value of nature, either because they lack education or intelligence or their unsophisticated practices are destructive, they say. And so the idea is that the government must intervene in order to protect the environment from the people who have been living there, sometimes for generations. Now, this kind of narrative and the stereotypes that it holds come in many forms and from many voices. Sometimes the racism and classism behind such accusations are more explicit than in other cases. And I have read and heard these kinds of things from Europeans, Tanzanians, and Americans alike. Because of this thinking, there's a tendency sometimes in conservation policies and programs to target the behaviors and attitudes of the least powerful, to label the people who live next to a protected area as the problem, instead of identifying the extractive and destructive tendencies that create large-scale environmental problems in the first place as a root cause for things like encroachment on protected areas. Now, this emphasis on local people as a problem continues to motivate evictions and injustices. And as I learned about conservation from these readings that I was doing in light of colonialism and inequality, I became curious. What's it like to live on the borders of a protected area? You know, what's it like to be a human in a place where the government sees people as a problem? And how do ordinary people go about their everyday lives to navigate those kinds of conflicts? Now, with these questions in mind, I went to the East Usambara Mountains to research life on the borders of a protected area called Amani Nature Reserve, which the government established in 1997. And to give you a better sense for this place, here are just a couple photos from the area. Here's a picture. You can see the forested mountains rising up out of the lowlands. Here's a picture of one area of the village, and what you can see here are houses pretty close to the forest border. I mean, you can really see a dense forest intact right there, along with some, depending on what you're able to, what plants you know, there's a clove tree and some coconut trees, so crops growing right next to people's houses in between there and the forest. Just another section of the area where people live. This is another village. Again, you can see the protected forest as this wall right here, that, as well as some more sparsely planted trees elsewhere that still exist on people's private farms. And you can see houses of a different type in this picture, which reflects some of the inequality in the region. So now what I found in my research was that many of the residents of these villages appreciated and participated in forest conservation. Not all, but many did. And I found that they were participating in forest conservation in creative ways. Now, by that, I mean that village residents contributed to conservation not only when and where the government asked them to participate. They also exhibited environmental leadership on their own time and in their own terms. Another finding is that the residents of these villages were not the ignorant, poorly informed, apathetic people suggested by common stereotypes. Instead, I found that people who critically reflected upon conservation, people who actively debated the value of the forest, taking multiple local and global considerations into account in village meetings and in ordinary conversations. Now, I only have time for one example. In February 2015, one of the villages that shares a border with Amani Nature Reserve held its quarterly council meeting. I attended the event. The meeting took place in a single-room building that had no electricity, no plumbing. It was just cement walls, a roof. There was a desk, some benches, flip chart paper taped to the walls with handwritten information about the villages. And slowly, the dozen or so elected members of the village council arrived. And the village chair opened the meeting in the typical fashion, and the executive officer read the agenda. Now, there were several items on the agenda, but agenda item number 6 is the one that I want to tell you about. It was for the council to decide on a written request from one village resident, who I'll call Mr. J. Now, they read the letter out loud. And in this letter, Mr. J was asking for permission to clear a section of the village forest in order to grow spices and vegetables so that he could earn some money. Now, to better understand what Mr. J was asking, we need to look at the land situation in the village. Here's a satellite image just from Google Earth of Amani Nature Reserve. That is pretty hard to see. I don't know if we can dim the lights just right here. The darker green areas is the protected forest. There's a light green area that looks pretty uniform. That's a tea plantation. And then the kind of patchwork areas in the middle are farms. And this is the village in question, also from Google Earth. We're talking about like that kind of tan section in the middle is where I'm going to talk about, and that's about 2 square miles or so, about a mile across, 2 miles up and down. And here you can see the protected forest. You can see a strong, like a very definite line on the borders of the protected forest. You can also see some of that light green tea on another side and over here on this side. And in the middle of that patchwork, those farms and other places. What's interesting is in the middle of you can also see some trees all the way in the middle of the village. And some of these are village forests. That is, the village council manages this, not the central government. And they decide the rules of when they cut down trees, if they don't, if they do, who has access, etc. Now, and here's just an image from the ground of that same village. Farmland's pretty dense, and there are trees all about. Now, each family needs about 2 acres or so, they say, to have enough food or money just to get by. But with increasing population density and increasing inequality, some families have that and have more, and others have much less. And so the poorest in this village really struggle on a daily basis to get by. Newcomers to the village can't access land to farm. So relatively speaking, Mr. J was a newcomer. In this context, extra space to grow some cash crops can really help a family put food on the table. And once Mr. J's letter requesting land was read out loud, the village council members started to debate and discuss the request. And I want to show just some quotes from that conversation that came out. One person said the request was for an entire valley, which is a protected area, not to be used, and not even the school could have used it for growing food when they had asked in the past. Another person said that the village council had the idea of keeping that land forested for the sale of carbon gas, which I can explain later. If you're not familiar with carbon exchange programs. The area in question is not a farm, but a village forest, another person said. And last year, someone wanted to start a youth program on livestock on that land, but the request was rejected because it would have involved cutting down trees. Somebody else said, outside of the village forest, there's nowhere else upon which we rely for our forest needs. And that area of the village has already been protected as a forest, again, for the sake of harvesting carbon gas. Then somebody suggested that Mr. J could instead go into beekeeping, which is a forest-friendly economic activity promoted by conservationists in Tanzania. The council agreed, and they decided to inform Mr. J of their decision. Now, for an ethnographer, this council discussion is the data. These quotes are the data. And what I see in this data is evidence that kind of negates the stereotypes common about people who live next to protected areas. From the village council's discussion, we can see that these are not people who are ignorant about the forest's importance. Instead, we can see that they clearly care about their village's forests, and they weigh environmental considerations in their regular duties and encourage their neighbors to not cut down trees and instead pursue forest-friendly economic activities. And the bigger point I'm trying to make is this. I could have only collected this kind of data through long-term ethnographic observation. This was not a one-off interview, where the way I might phrase a questions quickly can really impose the way that the answer is going to come through. And this also was not an event that I could have just walked up to the village and been allowed to attend on my very first day there. So it really took long-term work to get permission to do this and to develop the trust. So it's through ethnography, that is, it's through spending time building rapport with people, through listening and observing, instead of demanding answers to pre-planned and maybe quantifiable questions in a hurry, that this more important data emerged. And that is data that can be used to paint a much more accurate picture of how Omani's residents consider forest conservation in their everyday lives. And so how does this kind of research go from being just knowledge that I have to actually making a difference? In general, I try to share my findings with stakeholders, conservation biologists, the people in the villages. And this is something that, as a professional anthropologist, I'm actually in a position to do. Just last month, when I was in Tanzania, I had the chance to meet with representatives from the Tanzanian government. And they said the stereotypical things, such as people who live next to Omani don't understand the forest, they don't understand the importance of conservation, and they don't know about forest-friendly economic activities. But I was able to respond with examples like this one, as well as an array of other examples, explaining that people did have a fair amount of understanding of their own forest, and they took conservation quite seriously, and that they propose eco-friendly businesses on their own terms and in their own ways, some of which are supported and others not. And so I'll close by saying that this is really about, this talk is more ethnography matters. And anthropology gave birth to ethnography perhaps, but it doesn't own it. And so I think just having the skills from anthropology, whether you apply that toward any other field or even one of the professional fields that it's commonly used in, can really make a difference and help you no matter where you take your studies or your career. Thank you.